Hello, I'm Jennifer Borderud, Director of the Armstrong Browning Library and Museum at Baylor University, and I am happy to welcome you to today's lecture by poet and author Fiona Sampson. But before we begin, I would like to thank Baylor's Bell Poetry Festival Committee and Committee Chair Professor Sarah Ford for partnering with us to bring you this lecture and yesterday's wonderful poetry reading, which I hope you were able to attend. I would also like you to know that at the conclusion of today's lecture, Dr. Joshua King, Associate Professor of English at Baylor, will moderate a Q&A, so you can enter your questions for our speaker in the Q&A box in Zoom at any time. Finally, Baylor students who would like to receive Creative Arts Experience credit for attending today will see a QR code on the screen at the end of the event. Now to introduce our speaker. Fiona Sampson is a leading British poet published in 38 languages who has received international awards in the US, India, and Europe. A fellow of the Royal Society of Literature, of the English Association, and of the Wordsworth Trust, she has published 29 books and received an MBE, which stands for Member of the Most Excellent Order of the British Empire, for services to literature. Emeritus Professor, University of Roehampton, she has served on the Council of the Royal Society of Literature and is a trustee of the Royal Literary Fund. Other honors include the Newdigate Prize, Cholmondeley Prize, Hawthornden Fellowship, and numerous awards from the Art Councils of England and of Wales, Society of Authors, Poetry Book Society, and the Arts and Humanities Research Council, as well as various National Book of the Year selections. She recently received 3 major European prizes: the Naïm Fasheri Laureateship, the European Lyric Atlas Prize, and the Wales Poetry Book of the Year. She is also a broadcaster and newspaper critic, librettist, and literary translator, and was editor of Poetry Review from 2005 to 2012. Her internationally acclaimed biographies are In Search of Mary Shelley, published in 2018 and shortlisted for the Biographers Club Slightly Foxed Prize, and Two-Way Mirror, The Life of Elizabeth Barrett Browning, published this year. She also currently serves as Digital Fellow of the Armstrong Browning Library and Museum and is curating a digital exhibition on Elizabeth Barrett Browning, utilizing the library's rare book and manuscript collections. Now, please join me in welcoming Professor Fiona Sampson.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. And my thanks also to the Armstrong Browning Library and Beall in general for my digital fellowship, which I'm absolutely thrilled to be holding. I wish I were there with you, but I feel close, and I'm already finding the work we're beginning to do with the archives. It seems hard to dignify it with the term curatorial, since I feel that Jennifer Borderud is doing all the curatorial work, but I'm finding the connections that we're making absolutely fascinating. And I owe the library and Jennifer a great debt in any case, because many of the illustrations in my biography of Elizabeth Barrett Browning are taken from the holdings of the library. And indeed, you'll see some of them during my PowerPoint as I talk now. So there are lots of ways to talk about Elizabeth Barrett Browning. One could talk about her effect on the course of literary development, specifically poetic development, in at least 2 continents since the 19th century. One could talk about her as a social pioneer. One could talk about her distance from us or her proximity to us in cultural terms. But I want to talk about image making and Elizabeth Barrett Browning. And to do so, let's go to the next slide. And I'd like to start with the opening passage of Elizabeth Barrett Browning's best-selling verse novel, Aurora Leigh. It's a book about how a woman becomes a poet. And it starts with the tempting suggestion that the self on the page mirrors the self who writes a page. So Aurora Leigh starts. Of writing many books there is no end, and I, who have written much in prose and verse for others' uses, will write now for mine, will write my story for my better self, as when you paint your portrait for a friend who keeps it in a drawer and looks at it long after he has ceased to love you, just to hold together what he was and is. Of course, it's my contention that Aurora Leigh holds together the portrait not of a friend, but of its own author, as she shows us something of what it takes to become a woman poet in the middle of the 19th century. As I started working on Elizabeth, I was astonished to find that there hadn't been a full-length biography since 1988, when the novelist Margaret Forster wrote a very feelingful biography concentrating on the earlier years, not least because the correspondence and other supporting material had not yet been archived. Yet, Elizabeth Barrett Browning is a canonical figure. So, what went wrong is perhaps the question. Next slide, please. This is my favourite portrait of Elizabeth Barrett Browning, who liked to style herself EBB. Obviously, you can see I liked it so much, it's become the book cover. In it, she simultaneously turns away and looks back over her shoulder at us. In one sense, of course, every historical figure does this, glancing over their shoulder towards the future where we are watching them, even while they face away from us into their own time. But Barrett Browning makes the gesture particularly provocative. Her wide, sensual mouth dips and rises in a curly bracket. Skeptical, even teasing, her gaze has a directness that seems startlingly modern. Which is an irony, since it's an image that has been constructed by thoroughly old-fashioned means. The frontispiece for the 4th British edition of her best-selling verse novel, Aurora Leigh, is an engraving after an ambrotype taken specifically for this purpose. On the afternoon in September 1858, when a shutter falls on the poet's half-smile in a stuffy studio on Le Havre harbourfront, photography is understood to be neither artistic nor detailed enough for portraiture. It will be another half dozen years before Julia Margaret Cameron starts to produce her famous and markedly pre-Raphaelite images of friends and family. And so the portrait that eventually results from this sitting won't be created by the photographer, but by a founder member of the pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood itself, Dante Gabriele Rossetti, who is a friend of EBB and of her husband and fellow poet, Robert Browning. But his are not the only hands her image passes through. First, it's engraved by a less stellar craftsman, Thomas Oldham Barlow. As the artist edits the result, notes and sketches sprawl over Rossetti's offprint. He instructs his engraver to be faithful to the photograph portrait they're working from. For example, removing, quotes, a sort of smile not in the photograph and not characteristic of the original. And he's had plenty of chances to study this original at the Brownings' home, which he calls an evening resort where I never feel unhappy. In the 2 years since the hugely successful appearance of Elizabeth's pioneering 9-book Bildungsroman, which is the first to tell the story of a woman becoming a writer, Rossetti's initial impressions, quotes, as unattractive a person as can well be imagined. She looks quite worn out with illness and speaks in the tone of an invalid, have turned to admiring protectiveness. Now he replaces the photographer's stock studio furniture with a symbolic writing desk and instructs Barlow to darken their subject's hair and enlarge her signature dark eyes in order to make her look a little younger and less worn out with illness. After all, this portrait's whole purpose is to extinguish what her husband calls certain horrible libels on humanity published as portraits of her in America. And if we go on to the next frame, we can see just how worn out she was looking. This is another shot from the same photographic session. And in it, we can see those great dark rings under her eyes, how she completely doesn't know how to pose, but also how sort of intrinsically camera shy she is. That way of looking down, but kind of looking up under her eyebrows is it's actually very Lady Diana Spencer. But it's a very sad photograph, I think. And you can see her poorly sick hands with their fingerless mittens. So not surprising that there's a kind of supportive desire to, as if, rehabilitate the woman herself by rehabilitating her image from her friends and her husband. Earlier, shipping a copy of the photograph from this session itself to Aurora Leigh's American publishers, Robert Browning assured them just a shade too urgently that, quotes, "What you receive is the sun's simple truth without a hair's breadth of retouching." Well, up from Italy to spend the summer with Elizabeth's English family, the Brownings have picked out Le Havre as a halfway meeting point. On the very last day of what turn out to be 2 unsatisfactory, tiring family months at the Normandy port, Robert finds that clever man to conduct the photographic session with his camera-shy wife. Jean-Victor Macaire Warno and his brother Louis Cyrus Macaire, who share a waterfront studio, are renowned technical pioneers. Yet the image that briefly saw commercial distribution in North America is oddly unclear, and the publishers, C.S. Francis & Co., do not end up using it. Look closer, though, and for all Robert's insistence that there isn't a hair's breadth of retouching, it turns out to have been clumsily overpainted. In fact, within 2 sentences, his letter is contradicting itself, remarking that Macaire Warno has worked up detail that got lost in the reproductive process. Who, apart from Robert, a keen amateur artist, could have such a strong motive for intervention? We can't be absolutely sure we caught him red-handed, but what we do know is that, luckily, he's kept back an untouched original. It's this version that Barlow and Rossetti use, and in it, the unexpurgated Elizabeth Barrett Browning has dark eyes and arched dark eyebrows. Her nose is long, so is its upper lip with its sexy overbite. Her face is asymmetric. Cover the right side and the left seems soulful and focused. Cover the left and the right appears amused. And both this original photograph and the hand-touched, rather odd image that looks like nothing so much as folk art are in the Armstrong Browning holdings. Next slide, please. In the 21st century, we recognize instantly the Brownings' anxiety about this key publicity shot and their need to control the image of the international celebrity that 52-year-old Elizabeth Barrett Browning has become by 1858. The irony is that, despite being so anxiously aware of the ramifications of image making, she is destined to become a notorious object lesson in how images of famous individuals get distorted. The Brownings would have been astonished and mortified to see myths about their private life obscure first her work and eventually even her identity. And this bronze of their clasped hands, there are a number of copies, one of which is at Beall and one of which is at the church, St. Marylebone in London, where the Brownings got married. It's a cast that's life-size, and when you see it in the flesh or in the bronze, you realize just how petite they both were, just how small their hands were. Nevertheless, Elizabeth Barrett Browning is a pivotal literary and cultural figure, much tougher than her physique suggests. She changed the direction of English language poetry and influenced both her contemporaries and subsequent generations of poets and readers. She also exerted real social political clout, and her ethical poetics changed debates about child labor, rape and the trafficking of women, Italian independence, and the American abolition of slavery. Still today acknowledged as Britain's greatest ever woman poet, she's the author of one of the most famous and much quoted poems in the language and Britain's official favourite poem, How Do I Love Thee? Let Me Count the Ways. When she died, she was mourned as a political heroine in revolutionary Italy. And yet, within 70 years of her death, popular culture would reduce her to a swooning poetess in whose little couch-bound life only a tyrannical father and ardent poet-lover brought drama. In the next slide, please. The damage was done above all by Rudolph Bézier's 1931 Broadway hit, The Barretts of Wimpole Street, which was followed by 3 film versions, a Norma Shearer and Charles Laughton vehicle, 1934, 1957's remake with Jennifer Jones and John Gielgud, and the 1982 TV movie with Jane Lapotaire and Joss Ackland. There were also 7 further remakes for TV, and there was even a musical whose numbers include I Want to Be Well and Pass the Eau de Cologne. In these successive remakes of Bézier's domestic melodrama, the actors playing Elizabeth's father tellingly share star billing. So there's obviously already something reductive going on. The image we have up on screen now is from the terrace in Wimpole Street where Elizabeth lived, although she actually only lived there for fewer than 6 years in total. This is not the actual house, which was flattened by a bomb during the Second World War, but it's the style. By the 1970s, when Saul Bellow, Philip Roth and John Updike crowded the book charts, the roaring boys of North American literary criticism would go a stage further, maligning Elizabeth Barrett Browning as relevant to the history of literature only through marriage, or worse, as hindering that real writer, her husband. In 1973's Oxford Anthology of English Literature, handsome paired volumes designed as an authoritative student resource, and which are actually on the shelf behind me, although I don't think you can see them, Lionel Trilling and Harold Bloom pronounce, quotes, Miss Barrett became an invalid for still mysterious reasons from 1838 to 1846, when she eloped with the best poet of the age. Her long poem, Aurora Lee, was much admired even by Ruskin, but is very bad. Quite bad too are the famous sonnets from the Portuguese. Though the Brownings' married life was reasonably happy, Mrs. Browning's enthusiasms gave her husband much grief. Perhaps the tendentiousness of this is unsurprising. The anthology's editors print just one minor poem by Elizabeth, but then the only other writing by women to feature in its more than 4,500 pages comprises one minor poem each by Edith Sitwell and Stevie Smith, 2 by Emily Bronte, and some passages from Dorothy Wordsworth's diaries, in total fewer than 24 pages, or around 0.5% of their canon. Excluded also, for example, are all of the Bronte's novels, Jane Austen, Mary Shelley, George Eliot, Virginia Woolf, and many more. Literary revisionism on this scale is strenuous stuff. And within the continual process of reputation making and remaking that is literary history, Elizabeth Barrett Browning has remained a bellwether for the rising and sinking stock of women writers. It's probably no coincidence that the melodramatic exploitation of her life story came to an end in the 1980s, as women's writing became more widely read, rediscovered, and taught. Next slide, please. Half a century earlier, when The Barretts of Wimpole Street was already a cultural phenomenon, Virginia Woolf, who went to see the play, summed up the poet's then standing, quotes, passionate lovers in curls and side whiskers, oppressed, defiant, eloping. In this guise, thousands of people must know and love the Brownings who have never read a line of their poetry. But fate has not been kind to Mrs. Browning as a writer. Nobody reads her. Nobody discusses her. Nobody troubles to put her in her place. Thus, Virginia Woolf in her Common Reader. But she herself was complicit in this. Her own version, Flush, a biography, written from the reductive perspective of Elizabeth's pet spaniel, does nothing to dignify the poet or reclaim her literary significance. Nevertheless, here is the frontispiece and title page of the first edition, which I'm very fond of, printed at the Hogarth Press, in other words, by the very hand of, by Virginia herself, with Leonard Woolf. Of course, that's not Flush himself in the photograph. Flush died before the era of, well, there were daguerreotypes just, but he died before the era of photography. Elizabeth's life dramatizes the two-way creation of every writing self. That's to say, from without and from within, in other words. That the life of the body both enables and limits the life of the mind is the paradox of the thinking self. John Keats's early death, or the 17-year-old poet's suicide in Henry Wallace's The Death of Chatterton, are moving because they remind us how a dead poet falls silent. But life imposes its own limits on the writer too. For every Lord Byron or Malcolm Lowry seizing the day in ways that their work celebrates, there's a John Clare or a Primo Levi trying to write experience away. Next slide, please. We could see writers' bodies creating a kind of resistance, forcing interplay between self and world. Elizabeth Barrett Browning turned 12 in 1818, the year that Frankenstein's creature first found out how deeply what happens to a body changes its wearer. And perhaps it's no accident that he is the creation of another woman writer. It used to be a feminist truism that René Descartes had it wrong, and there is no separation between mind and body. Yet bodies do disguise, shield, or isolate minds. To spend any time with someone whose body is failing is to understand that recognizing the unimpaired selfhood within is both human and humane. So, do we inhabit the body in ways that are inseparable from how we think and feel? Or are we ghosts in a curvaceous machine, to borrow from the formulation of the 20th century British language philosopher Gilbert Ryle? Here, by the way, we have another frontispiece and title page, and this is that 4th edition of Aurora Leigh with that Rossetti engraving. And I think the juxtaposition of the portrait of Elizabeth with the name Aurora Leigh shows us just how close this Bildungsroman, this story of how a self becomes, is about both the real woman and the fictional woman. Today, the virtual world seems to offer us the experience of ourselves as pure will, without the resistances of the concrete world. And if we turn back 2 centuries, we find Elizabeth Barrett Browning using the written word in virtual ways to take part in the wider world while remaining bodily at home on her daybed. In doing so, she is transcending chronic illness, disability, gender, the lack of education that comes with her gender, as well as her belief that she was of Caribbean, American, African origin. In the event, the thinking self that speaks in Elizabeth Barrett Browning's work has triumphantly outlived her. But how telling it is that the fictionalized character of Elizabeth that's replaced her in the popular imagination is almost entirely bodily, scarcely a mind at all. Next slide, please. The actual facts of her life are more interesting than the melodrama. She was born in County Durham in the north of England in 1806, the first of what would eventually be 12 children. In 1809, her father bought Hope End in Herefordshire, not far from where I'm sitting now, where he spent a fortune building a new mansion in Orientalist style. There followed an idyllic childhood. The Barrett siblings were close, and Elizabeth's talent was recognised early by her parents, who preserved and even published her juvenilia. Next slide, please. That wonderful Orientalist mansion has disappeared. It was pulled down by a subsequent owner, but the parkland still remains. This is the high viewpoint of Oyster Hill, and It remains very beautiful in a deeply romantic, capital R romantic way. However, with adolescence came the onset of the ill health that was to define much of the rest of Elizabeth's life. And when she was 15, she spent a year away from home at Gloucester Spa Hotel, confined to a spinal sling. This quasi-torture was the start of a pattern of poor diagnosis and treatment, which led to an adult life of chronically disabling, often life-threatening lung disease. It also introduced the laudanum, to which she would be addicted for the rest of her life. Next slide, please. Although her mother, Mary Barrett Moulton Barrett, died in 1828 when Elizabeth was 22, the poet's status as an invalid confined to her room released her from the domestic responsibilities that would normally have fallen to an eldest daughter, and an eldest of 12, moreover. She was able to devote herself to her largely self-taught intellectual development, especially a fierce pursuit of excellence in translating Greek verse and her own poetry. From the outside, these years look somewhat featureless. And let me just say that the slide you're looking at now is the Gloucester Spa, not the hotel, but the spa building itself. Nothing like the glorious pump rooms of Bath, familiar to you, I'm sure, from Jane Austen's novels, and nothing like the beautiful pump rooms in nearby Cheltenham, which is just 12 miles from Gloucester. This is a really utilitarian building, isn't it? It looks like a sort of railway halt, a 19th century railway halt in the middle of nowhere. So featurelessness and some toughness of survival. At the same time, however, a contested will relating to Elizabeth's father's inheritance was forcing retrenchment. Her mid-20s coincided with a period of intense familial anxiety. The possibility of having to live on the family's estates in Jamaica was mooted. So was the related likelihood that the family themselves were partly of African Caribbean heritage, something which in that era would have transformed their life chances. Elizabeth internalized this racism, and she would later confide, only once, to her husband-to-be, that she believed she had what she called the cursed blood of a slave. Deeply embroiled in this emerging writer's psyche too was the paradox that money from plantations, and so by extension from the enslavement of other people, had kept the family in style. Yet Elizabeth would become an ardent abolitionist and an advocate of human rights. Next slide. In 1832, when she was 26, Hope End was sold, and the family moved first to Sidmouth on the south coast of England, and then to London. The next years were a period of consolidation for Elizabeth, who began to develop friendships brokered by family friends with writers and editors. She had stepped into the professional literary world, a productive life, if one that had to be lived carefully indoors, seemed possible. But the years from 32 to 35 were a period of frustration and loss. Two of Elizabeth's brothers died, including her favourite, the eldest, Bro, or Edward. She spent 3 years in lonely exile in Torquay, fighting chronic pulmonary illness. The benefits of sea air were slow to materialise, and by 1840, the grieving EBB believed that she was dying. And this photograph is of the terrace in Torquay where Elizabeth rented a house, and she lived right on the harbour front. The harbour is just in the front of the photograph, in the foreground where the steps are, which meant that she could hear the sea all day and all night. And not only did she find it drearily repetitive, but her beloved Bro had died in a boating accident. He had died by drowning in that very sea. And she felt that the responsibility was hers because she had begged for him to stay in Torquay with her rather than going back to London to resume his life. Next slide, please. And here is another actual address. This is the actual 50 Wimpole Street, now the British Dental Association. Before the war, when it looked like the rest of the terrace, it was also a dentist's. Still, in 1838, her father had acquired 50 Wimpole Street, and it was here that Elizabeth rejoined her family the following year. though she would actually live at the address famously associated with her for a total of fewer than 6 years. The poet had her own bed sitting room from which she rarely stirred. Her resulting output was so substantial that when William Wordsworth died in 1850, she became the first woman to be nominated for Poet Laureate. It would take another 159 more years before a woman was actually appointed, of course. In the event, the honour went to Alfred Tennyson. Elizabeth's poem, The Cry of the Children, published in Blackwood's magazine in 1843, was instrumental in the campaign to abolish child labour. Poems 1844 made her one of Britain's most widely read writers at a time when poetry had a mass readership as literacy spread and the new middle class emerged. And at a time when many women writers, including Jane Austen, Mary Shelley, the Bronte sisters, and George Eliot, felt compelled to write under male pseudonyms or else anonymously, she always published under her own name. After Poems 1844, one of Elizabeth's newfound admirers was a fellow poet, Robert Browning. 6 years her junior and only modestly successful, he nevertheless had a number of distinguished literary friends, including Thomas Carlyle and Walter Savage Landor, and he had an accurate appreciation of the importance of her work. He began a correspondence and eventually a year-long courtship that culminated in 1846, September the 12th, in fact, in a secret marriage. A week later, the couple ran away together to Europe. Elizabeth was 40 by now and an established literary figure, but she was also her father's favourite, the frail and gifted eldest child. By now a widower of uncertain social standing and without extended family in Britain, and what's more, empowered by the paternalism of congregational Christianity, Edward Moulton Barrett seems to have been unable to let any of his children marry, and indeed he disowned all 3 who did. Next slide. Elizabeth declared in letters home that Robert was, quote, perfect in all respects. But true love is nothing without the material means for it to happen, and she was exceptionally lucky in being financially independent of her father, thanks to personal family legacies. By the October of 1846, the Brownings had arrived in Italy, where they would settle for the rest of Elizabeth's life. After an idyll in a hotel in Pisa, they moved to Florence the following spring and, after a few months, found themselves a home on the Piano Nobile of Palazzo Guidi, which Elizabeth came to call Casa Guidi. And you can see it here in the photograph, the church on one side of the really quite narrow alley and those first floor windows and the very narrow balcony on opposite it. I was rather shocked when I went to visit Casa Guidi. I had imagined, as I think Elizabeth probably hoped that the readers of her letters, that's to say her sisters back home, would imagine, a whole palazzo with wide marble staircases and an inner courtyard and lots of rooms. But it's really just a first floor apartment in a city block. Nevertheless, 1848 was a time of optimism in Florence, the moment of La Giovane Italia and of hopes for an independent Republic of Italy. In this happy mood and busy homemaking, Elizabeth fell pregnant for what was already a 3rd time and, at the age of 43, gave birth to her son Pen, named for Robert's mother. Over the next years, both poets undertook striking creative developments, and during the 1850s, they made repeated journeys back to Britain to see their families and, primarily for Elizabeth's health, to various Italian summer resorts, and in winters, they went south to Rome. Next slide, please. Elizabeth proved herself, so to speak, intellectually warm-blooded. She'd always enjoyed literary life, and in Italy, improved health allowed her to socialise with many of the key writers and artists of her day. Among them Hans Christian Andersen, Thomas Carlyle, Georges Sand. She embraced the Italian political situation, most influentially in Casa Guidi Windows, published in 1851. In 1848, she published The Runaway Slave at Pilgrim's Point in the anti-slavery US anthology Liberty Bell. Her sequence of 44 sonnets from the Portuguese, first published in 1850 under that title intended to disguise their personal nature, had been secretly written about Robert during the Robert lovers' courtship. And in 1856, she published the hugely influential Aurora Leigh, an immediate bestseller. It was in many ways a model life, but even so much happiness must have its unhappy ending, it seems. By 1859, Elizabeth was once again increasingly unwell, flirting morbidly with spiritualism until her hope even in that ran out. She died in June 1861 at the age of 55 at home in Florence on that red couch in Casa Guidi. Today, the apartment in Casa Guidi is open as a museum, its furnishings painstakingly recollected or reconstructed. The couple shared the aesthetic tastes of their day. Their friend John Ruskin published the 2 volumes of Modern Painters in 1843 and 46, and his highly influential The 7 Lamps of Architecture appeared in 1849, after he'd undertaken a series of tours of Italy. The Brownings, in other words, were living an original that would soon be copied across Britain. Small wonder, perhaps, that when Elizabeth died in Casa Guidi in her husband's arms on June the 29th, 1861, her last word, recorded by him, was beautiful. Next slide. But hers isn't a story about art or life as just beauty, but about willpower. When Elizabeth emerges as a child prodigy and declares not only that she will be a poet, but that she already is one, it should be a reach too far. In 1806, the year of her birth, women can neither vote nor, in England at least, own property once married. Even the wealthiest receive relatively little formal education and are barred from all but the oldest profession. On marriage, they pass from their father's control to their husbands without becoming citizens in their own right. So it's not surprising that at the start of the 19th century, women writers tend to emerge in the company of literary men who have brought them along, whether by accident or design. The exceptional talents of Maria Edgeworth, Mary Shelley, and the Bronte sisters were all first recognized by educated intellectual fathers. Elizabeth's father was no intellectual, but he also encouraged his young daughter. Perhaps she owes her remarkable confidence to him. Quotes, "Literature was the star which in prospect illuminated my future days. It was the spur which prompted me, the aim, the very soul of my being," she asserts at 14. Born 9 years after Mary Shelley and 10 before Charlotte Bronte, she starts writing as a child of 6 and doesn't stop until 5 weeks before she dies. Her first surviving poem, On the Cruelty of Forcement to Man, about press gangs, is written in the Herefordshire country house of her childhood. Her last, The North and the South, a tribute to Hans Christian Andersen, almost 4 decades later in Rome in May 1861, 1 month before her death. Next slide, please. So what of this link between the poet and her poetry? Here she is pictured with 11-year-old pen a year before her death. We started with Aurora Leigh, the masterpiece Elizabeth publishes at 50, in which the fictional poet Elizabeth has invented writes a poetic masterpiece we never get to read. But we do get to read how the fictional poet feels about it, about her commitment to poetry. She says, quotes, "I may love my art. You'll grant that even a woman may love art, seeing that to waste true love on anything is womanly, past question. It's rhetoric which sounds like an own goal, but is in fact strategic. Lacking both social agency and an education in the classical arts of logic and rhetoric that father or husband have received, a woman born at the start of the 19th century is unlikely to win arguments by reasoning about who or what she is. She must learn instead to be stubborn, irrational. To claim that she too is a poet, she must arm herself with her own weakness, which is to say her enthusiasm. Quotes, "I lived those days and wrote because I lived, unlicensed else. My heart beat in my brain." My heart beat in my brain. Such a telling phrase. Next slide, please. Elizabeth's own success will be indubitable, the kind poets dream of and rarely achieve. Aurora Leigh, with which she crowns that success, sells out within a fortnight and goes on to be one of the best read literary works of the second half of the 19th century. When it appeared, form-expanding romantic biographies and memoirs by men, Jean-Jacques Rousseau's Confessions, William Godwin's Memoirs of the Author of a Vindication of the Rights of Woman, have long been valued, while Charlotte Bronte lists in a letter to a friend, Lives of the Poets, Boswell's Life of Johnson, Southey's Life of Nelson, Lockhart's Life of Burns, Moore's Life of Sheridan, Moore's Life of Byron, Wolfe's Remains. But Aurora Leigh is the first woman's Künstlerroman, the story specifically of a woman maker's development and written by a woman, and it will influence generations of poets and writers. Among the many for whom it's immediately formative are George Eliot, Charlotte Mew, the writing duo who make up Michael Field, and Emily Dickinson, who hangs the Rossetti portrait in her room. But its success isn't limited by gender. Leading male writers, among them Rudyard Kipling, John Ruskin, Algernon Swinburne, and Oscar Wilde, will celebrate the work for decades. Aurora Leigh is a work of fiction whose 9 books map only indirectly onto its author's own life. And here she is, photographed a month before her death. But it does portray the development of a woman poet. Thus, on her 20th birthday, the poem's protagonist, orphaned Aurora, refuses her marriage, both loving and advantageous, in order to dedicate herself to poetry. Just before she does so, she crowns herself with a poet's wreath. What, therefore, if I crown myself today in sport, not pride, to learn the feel of it? To learn the feel of it. If she delayed until she or the world felt confident that she deserved poetic laurence, how long would Aurora or Elizabeth wait? In fact, laurel wreaths will crown Barrett Browning's coffin for her civic funeral in Florence. But meanwhile, at 13, in the preface to her first printed work, The Battle of Marathon, Elizabeth writes, quotes, "Happily it is not now as it was in the days of Pope. Now, even the female may drive her Pegasus through the realms of Parnassus without being saluted with the most equivocal of all appellations, a learned lady, without being celebrated by her friends as a Sappho or traduced by her enemies as a pedant, without being abused in the review or criticized in society." Of course, the reception of her own work will go on to show this isn't always true. Yet Aurora, or Elizabeth, has her eye on the prize. She quotes, "Never can be satisfied with the comparative respect, which means absolute scorn. What matters to her is producing the best poetry, judged by the highest standards, rather than the patronizing reviewing that she parodies in Aurora Leigh." Quotes, "Among our female authors, we make room for this fair writer and congratulate the country that produces in these times such women competent to spell." Elizabeth Barrett Browning is not Aurora Leigh, but popular and critical reception is a kind of mirror, even a distorting one, as her life story shows us. Next slide, please. And literary biography is a kind of mirror too. It's always a Bildungsroman, the adventure story of how the thinking self emerges. And in this sense, the story Elizabeth Barrett Browning tells in Aurora Leigh is the one her life story tells us too. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Fiona, for a wonderful introduction to Elizabeth Barrett Browning for some, and also an introduction to your engagement with her as a biographer. And so we will have opportunity for questions now. I'd like to invite you, if you do have questions, to pose them. And you can do so by using the Q&A function that you'll see towards the bottom of your screens. I have one question to share with you, and I have some of my own too I hope to get into. So we'll turn it to one that has just come in from the audience. I greatly appreciate your discussion of the disparity between the 19th century reception of Aurora Leigh and the recasting of the poet as the ill poetess by 20th century literary scholars. Could you say something more about the popular Victorian reception of her more politically and socially contentious work? For many undergraduate students, it's surprising to see a 19th century woman publishing poetry that is so often politically engaged.
Thank you. What a great question. Yes, I think that it is unusual. I mean, she was unusual in the degree of the political engagement of her literary writing. She wasn't unusual across genres. You have to remember that she and Charles Dickens, although they were of different ages, emerged at roughly the same time. And you also have to remember that the kind of new mass readership that we associate with Charles Dickens, which is very moved in a sentimental way, but is also engaged by the socio-political critique of his novels. You know, we think of the kind of great queues, you know, for the new editions of the magazines in which work is serialized. You know, Has Little Nell Died? It is also Elizabeth's readership. You know, she had a mass readership at a time when reading was the new mass entertainment, because education was gradually becoming, first in Elizabeth's youth, a kind of ethical sine qua non, and gradually became enshrined in law. It became universal, at least to the age of 11, so that literacy suddenly took great strides and is associated with all sorts of things, the rise of congregational Christianity and so on, and indeed Chartism and various other sort of movements. But it also produces this mass readership who are, as we would say, Middle England. They are the clerking classes, to think of, you know, them in 19th century terms. And of course, that is always the pivot of popular opinion in Britain, that we are the middle. And this middle is always slightly slow to change. And so although Elizabeth, for example, the poem, The Cry of the Children, is a response to a published report into the iniquities of child labour in British mines and mills. So it's not original thinking. It, as it were, popularizes, it kind of colours in those facts for a readership and shifts it. And Elizabeth is very conscious of that remit. She has a strong sense, which she writes about, for example, in the introduction to her essay on mind, of the ethical potency of poetry and also the ethical obligations of poetry, that you write not for a kind of entertainment that's untethered in reality, but you write to make abstract philosophical ideas imaginable and to make ethical principles communicated. So again, when she writes The Runaway Slave at Pilgrim's Point, she writes it while she's still in her father's house. She doesn't publish it until she's left. But when she does publish it, she donates it to a fundraising publication. So she's not only making that statement, she is donating it in order to kind of raise money for the cause. She writes, she and Robert write a couple of poems. Actually, they don't do very well, but they write them to be published as a booklet to raise money for the Ragged Schools. That's to say, the charitably supplied public free schooling for the kids of the poor. She has a kind of, I don't want to say she has a humorlessness. I think she has a really strong ethical and indeed religious sense of mission. But she also has the great privilege of being really financially secure. I mean, more secure, for example, than the Brontes sisters. And from the time she's in Italy, she has the time of the security of being abroad. And so, although she publishes, as it were, nakedly under her own name, in another way, she is safe from the tides of popular opinion. And she can speak to that, the hearth and home, the kind of middle-brow center of British popular opinion, which she's quite shaped by and shares quite a lot of sentiment with. But she can speak to it from the safety of not facing a program from overseas.
Mm-hmm.
I could say much more, but I won't, or will. Yeah.
Well, actually, you know, some of the questions that are emerging are in dialogue with points you've just raised. And I wonder if we might turn back to The Runaway Slave for a moment with a question that comes up about it. You've begun to address some of these questions, and I think we can open up other avenues through them. Could you elaborate on your remarks about EBB's race politics, one viewer asks, abolitionism, and the way in which they play out in The Runaway Slave? And this viewer is particularly interested in the play in that poem on the word black and the several meanings that it takes on.
Yes, thank you. That's a really interesting question. I mean, I think it's very, very clear from context and from the context of the letter that Elizabeth writes to Robert about the blood of a slave and the whole of her demeanor for the rest of her life, that by that she means quite clearly that it's just an awful fate to be a slave. She doesn't mean there's something wrong with people who are enslaved. Quite the opposite. She means that the enslavement is wrong. And she feels anxious about her own possible ancestry because of the social consequences at that time. We have to remember that Robert's name for her is My Little Portuguese, and that obviously has to do with her coloring. She has dark hair, olive skin, big dark eyes, and she certainly doesn't look particularly Anglo-Saxon. And she, indeed, her paternal grandfather was from Madeira, where the population is largely Portuguese and or of enslaved people's descent, so either of Portuguese descent or of African descent. And it's possible that it's from there that she gets her coloring. She herself believed that she had direct Black ancestry. And I really, really wanted to find that, because she would be just such a phenomenal person to be able to claim as such a phenomenal role model. I couldn't find any direct vertical ancestry, but she had first cousins. I mean, it was very proximate. Both of her next two brothers who survived had children with women who had been enslaved. And indeed, her own favorite uncle had children with a woman who'd been enslaved. So, and in fact, her paternal grandmother's best friend and companion for the whole of Elizabeth's life, well, until they passed away, was a woman who had been born into an enslaved woman, and who herself kept slaves in that kind of awful mixed up, era. So there's all of that. So what's amazing about Runaway Slave, I think, and still so chilling, is obviously that Elizabeth grasps absolutely and forces us to grasp that all such cruelty is gratuitous. There's no sense of as a kind of normative or respectable, but there, oh, isn't it sad? The kind of, chain gang stuff. No, it's an obscenity. The woman has been raped. She has been horrified to have a child as a result of that rape, whom she has killed, and then she is killed for that crime. I mean, there's no redemption in it. And what I think is absolutely wonderful is that in the poem, which is in the first person, so it's the Black woman who speaks, white is the color of evil and black is reclaimed. So white is what's wrong. The white child, the white is the color of horror. And I just think that's absolutely brilliant, because it is so schematic, and you need something as schematic as that to try and try and produce monumental shifts in public opinion, which were necessary then. Mm-hmm. Still necessary now, but were really necessary then.
Right. And, I think this question and your response to it reminds us of a tension that you bring up in your biography several times, about the degree to which Elizabeth's own capacity as a writer and as someone who is, through their poetry, trying to intervene in these social inequalities and violence, is enabled by slavery.
Yeah.
And you several times in your biography call us back to say, well, think about the mirror that we need to look in ourselves, our own complicity in both the heritage of that and systematic injustices now. So several questions are coming up that get to your own involvement in complicity and interest, not complicity in a bad sense, but just that you are involved in Elizabeth's life. And how did that become a case for you of seeing yourself in her and your own interest in her? So if you don't mind, there's a wonderful line in your biography of Elizabeth that I'd like you to reflect on with us, that I think relates to this. This is towards the end. You have several frames you give us. And you say in your last closing frame, the imagination is greedy. As Elizabeth's readers, we respond to elements of her life we feel mirror our own. And you say a bit later in that same passage, I'm coming to accept that a biographer's own self always frames her subject. You give us some answers to that in the biography itself, but I wonder if you might elaborate a little bit more on how you see yourself framing your subject.
Thank you so much, Joshua. I'm so glad that and grateful that you've referred to the frames, because they seem to me a really important part of the project. I mean, they're partly there in homage to the kind of mirroring that I think Elizabeth's work performs to her life. I mean, in a sense, her life is her work. There isn't a lot else. I mean, I think it's the opposite of the melodrama version. I mean, I think really she had a very uninteresting life. It's all there in the work in a way. And above all, Aurora Leigh, in the degree to which it is and isn't, there are passages which are clearly her own poetic, well, they are her own poetics. And then there are passages, obviously, which are fictional and indeed quite melodramatic. So I wanted to pay tribute to that. But also, you know, she's the second 19th century woman writer that I have written a biography of. And the previous one was Mary Shelley. And I kind of fell in at the deep end with Mary Shelley. And so I was so busy reflecting on her and trying to get past the and then of conventional biography and to ask what can we know of what it must have been like? To what extent can we have any sense of, I don't know, what it is for her to look at a time when even glass is wobbly and, you know, blown by hand and so on, or you know, how closely can we enter into her experience in order to answer the question of how much can we know about how did she write Frankenstein at such an amazingly young age? And of course, that's already a kind of not skepticism about biography, but a kind of fascination with, or a questioning of, I want to take it apart and look at it from different angles. And with Elizabeth, I was so aware that she had been constructed as something, and then I was constructed as something else, and her work was constructed as something else. And that one should always acknowledge one's own positioning, you know, one's own location and complicity. I think that she taught me a lot about sheer determination and the kind of against the grainness of being a woman writer, and how hard it remains to be a woman writer even today. There are obviously the difficulties are different in scale, and some of them are different in character, but there are problems that we have in common, even, you know, today, and even I have in common with Elizabeth Barrett Browning, which have to do with the kind of willful misreadings, the kind of desire to see that a woman poet is somehow the feminine of poet, the diminutive of poet is poetess. And for example, you know, the very customary critical reception of, I mean, for example, I write a lot of eco-poetics. I'm quite a metaphysical poet. I write about environment, very, very often traduced as kind of pastoral by a certain kind of male critic, where a man writing quite similar territory, you know, contemporary mine, isn't. And so a sense of echoes, and perhaps a sense sometimes of writing about those frustrations through writing about her. I didn't feel the same sense of identification with Elizabeth Barrett Browning, inadvertent falling into friendship with, although I admire her enormously, as I did with Mary Shelley, where there were aspects of her character I could see in her life decisions, in the things she didn't understand, in the things she wrote, where I just completely recognized her. I just thought, oh yes, I know what you're doing there. I can feel that, you know. So this feels much more like a biography, looking at someone's conscious mind, their will, their intention, their planning, their strategies, their solutions. Whereas thinking about Mary Shelley was much more about thinking about the unconscious. What is it that must have formed you? What are the things that you experience you don't even know you're experiencing because they seem so normal to you?
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much for that insightful response of your own framing and engagement with Elizabeth. There are some questions that are raised about Elizabeth's acceptance that have come up several times, and particularly her legacy and how she's been treated. And you mentioned the ongoing difficulty that women writers can very often face. Another of our audience members has a question that's related to this. Given her impressive learning and publication across so many genres, including Greek translations and social and political engagement, why is her intellectual reputation nowhere near that of her near contemporary George Eliot?
Because she went first, I would say. I mean, I think the thing is that, when a whole body, the whole canon of other 19th century women and earlier 20th century women was being rediscovered in Britain by Virago Press. I mean, all sorts of people from Willa Cather, Christina Stead, I mean, not only British writers, and were being avidly read and reread and came back into the canon, came back into our reading habits, actually, not just the canon that we studied in MA, but the canon that we read. It was the 1970s and 80s, and nobody was reading poetry, particularly longer poetry and poetry of ideas, and that remains the case. I mean, Elizabeth is handicapped by the genre she wrote in. Simply what was a mainstream genre, possibly the most valued genre when she was writing, is now the least valued genre. And it's very sad and frustrating. So I think that's why. I mean, I think that we simply don't recognize, unless we're painstakingly writing a biography, we simply don't recognize, for example, a poem as an intellectual intervention or political intervention in the way that we do recognize an essay. Mm-hmm. Whether one published in the 19th century, I mean, or one that's published now in 2021. Yeah, I think it's enormously frustrating. And, also, I suppose, as her advocate now, I could wish she had written some other genres. Why always stick to the verse, Elizabeth? But of course, she thought she was sticking to the most influential and important genre.
It is important for us to remember is the status that poetry and poets held at this time, and why her intervention mattered so deeply for establishing a woman's voice in that sphere, even despite the mischaracterizations and difficulties she faced in that.
Absolutely.
There's among the difficulties she faced, and that is too often made a subject of melodrama, is of course her illness. And so we have several viewers who've been interested in her illness and how it's reflected in her work. You navigate this in your biography several places, but if you would be willing to talk more about that, about particularly how you decide to represent her illness and its reflection in her poetry.
I think that Elizabeth's illness reflects in the poetry most in the slowness of her development, the tardiness of her development, the extent to which it constricted her intellectual development. Of course, she would have been very constricted in her intellectual development, her contacts and so on anyway, because she was a woman, not a man. And even if she hadn't had a very strict father, she wouldn't have been able to go to literary salons and so on. I mean, in the way that someone like Mary Russell Mitford could, who was a woman of a certain age and, was the financial, was keeping her own father and therefore had the freedom to act like a man in a way. So I think that's the main. I mean, Elizabeth's. Yeah, I don't think that the sort of the streak of the slightly smudgy Gothic and sort of Orientalist Gothic that you get, in fact, the Layer of the Brown Rosary and so on. I think those poems, they might have a laudanum influence, but they might not. I think that's just, we don't think that when we read Tennyson, so why should we? Elizabeth is a little bit reductive and once again back to the body. But her illness was real, and far from being a kind of neurotic, get out clause or whatever, a sign of her weakness is actually a sign of her strength, because I think she had really major health problems. And I think that one knows that from the record, from the doctor's reports and so on. Of course, I'm not a clinician, and even any clinician alive today can't examine her. So we can only go on the symptoms reported and the patterns of her illness and its duration. But crudely, it seems to me what's most of all likely is probably, because she and her sisters had measles, and then the sisters recovered and she didn't. And it seems as though really she had probably some kind of post-viral thing. And I think until COVID, we all had this sense of, oh, well, we know all illnesses. So come on, that we can give it a name, and we can decide where it should have been curtailed and how it should have been managed and so on. And I suspect that it's much more compound. She was made a kind of chronic invalid, and then she just was asthmatic and bronchial, and in the days before antibiotics and steroid inhalers, even that was fatal. I mean, was life-threatening every winter. Every winter when she got a cold, she got a cough that could have killed her. I mean, I happen to be somebody who every time I get a cold gets a cough that's really nasty and I have to have antibiotics for it. But I live in the 20th and 21st century, and so it hasn't killed me. But I think COVID reminds us just how real and how scary and how actually on the brink of mortality she was. It isn't a kind of hysterical something or other. She really was. These were the realities she lived with, and she found them hugely frustrating. She didn't play them up. She wanted to play them down. She hated being confined to her room. The day bed wasn't a recourse, it was a compromise which stopped her having to be in bed all the time. So, I think the reception is inside out. And again, I think that reception is gendered, and because of the genre. I think if she were a male novelist, we wouldn't think like that. No one says, oh, Proust, it was a hysterical illness. Everyone says he was a great writer and he had terrible asthma, and he lived in a city.
Mm-hmm. Yes, thank you. And I think you're completely right about the inequalities and the way illness is treated in this area. We have time, I think, for just one last question. And I want to let the students who have been watching know that if you will hang on until we are finished with this last question, you'll have an opportunity to see the QR code that you'll need to scan for credit, for your creative arts credit, for joining us today. So hold on for that. So here's one last question that has come up for us. As a woman poet, what inspired you to write a biography on EBB? How do you think she expressed her feminism, given Wollstonecraft and Mitford were her mentors? This is coming from one of our viewers.
Thank you very much. Well, Mitford, of course, was a great enabler, and Mary Russell Mitford, and published Elizabeth, introduced her to people, introduced her to the whole circle of women writers, Lady Dacre, the ladies of Llangollen, and yeah, I think saw Elizabeth very much as a mentee. I mean, obviously she admired her and loved it when Elizabeth outgrew her in literary terms. Wollstonecraft, she was an influence on the page. She was passionate about her when she was 13. So I think that the Wollstonecraft is very clear in the very early writing. The early essays that Elizabeth wrote when she was still, pre-adolescent are very touching. And indeed, she wrote a wonderful piece for a younger niece in which she talked about herself in the third person. She called herself Beth, and she talked about how Beth loved horse riding, and she was a real tomboy, and she was going to be a great poet. She was going to out Homer, but she had this one huge disadvantage, which she was a woman, she was a girl, and she hated women. One word she hated above everything was feminine, and she hated the weaknesses that women were supposed to parade. Their headaches, their little frailties. So that's her most feminist. I think she displayed her feminism by absolutely being unshakable in her vocation at a time when, there were other women poets. So, there was Felicia Hemans as well, for example, as well. But women writers were few and far between, and poetry being the highest form and seen as sort of, in a sense, the driest, most masculine, exalted form, was the highest mountain to climb. And she just was determined not to be put off. She saw her gender as a social construct. I mean, what her gender allowed and didn't allow her to do as not essential, but a social construct, because she was actually very feminine too. I mean, her later letters, she loved being a mother. Her later letters she's very much in love with Robert. Her later letters are full of, frocks and home furnishings. I mean, there are lots and lots of letters about choosing the fabric for the windows that Cars are greedy and so on. So she delighted in all of that, but she didn't see why that should stop her being able to think or write or have a passionate political heart. And of course, she was right about that.
Yes, and you've helped us appreciate that struggle and the legacy that she leaves us to confront and to continue to come to terms with very well in your interaction with us today and your generous response to questions. And of course, especially in your biography, which I hope everyone will follow up on and read. You'll find it very much worth the engagement. So thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you to Professor Fiona Sampson for sharing with us. And I wish you all a good afternoon. For students, hang on just for a second and you'll see that QR code come up, and hope you all have a good rest of your days. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Joshua, and thank you so much everyone for coming along.